The morning I found my truck buried under a mountain of wet cement, I genuinely thought I was hallucinating. I stood at the end of my driveway, coffee mug in hand, staring at the gray sludge completely coating the hood, windshield, and roof of my 1997 Chevy Silverado. My name's Wyatt Peterson, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 7 years. Long enough to know when the HOA is up to something shady, which is almost always. But this was a whole new level of crazy. Wyatt, screeched a voice that made my spine stiffen. I didn't have to look. I knew that voice. Margaret Willow, the HOA president and self-declared queen of the cul-de-sac. She was stomping across my lawn in her usual pastel tracksuit and oversized sunglasses, her little clipboard clutched like a weapon. "This is what happens when you ignore citation after citation," she said, pointing that clipboard at me like it was a sword. "We told you no commercial vehicles in the driveway overnight. You left it out here for 3 nights in a row. It's my personal truck," I said flatly, "and that rule doesn't apply when the vehicle is registered to the homeowner and used for private purposes." "I already responded to your notices." "Well, the board voted otherwise," she sniffed. I looked back at the truck, then at the 2 orange construction cones still sitting on the street next to a half-empty cement mixer. And then I noticed him, Randy, the HOA's go-to handyman, standing awkwardly by the mixer with his eyes fixed on the ground. "You poured cement on my truck," I said slowly, jaw clenched. "You actually hired someone to dump cement on it." "You should have complied," Margaret snapped. "We're tired of people like you thinking the rules don't apply. Maybe next time you'll follow the guidelines." I stared at her, stunned. "This isn't a fine, Margaret. This is a felony. Call it what you want," she said, turning on her heel. "We gave you plenty of chances." I pulled out my phone, heart pounding. "No, you didn't. You just committed property damage in broad daylight. And I've got the footage to prove it." Her head turned just enough to catch the glint of my security camera mounted above the garage. "Smile," I said. "You're on candid camera." Officer Delgado stood with 1 foot on my driveway, jotting in his notepad while eyeing the concrete-caked Chevy. The late morning sun was starting to bake the mess into a crust, and the air already smelled like wet gravel and burnt coffee. I held the mug loosely in one hand, no longer interested in drinking it. "You're telling me this was intentional?" Delgado asked, eyes flicking toward the mixer truck still idling by the curb. "Intentional, authorized, and orchestrated by the HOA," I said. "I've already pulled the security footage from last night. Shows Randy over there taking instructions from Margaret while she's pointing at my truck." Delgado's partner, a younger guy named Torres, walked back over from the sidewalk where he'd just been snapping photos of the scene. He looked like he'd just walked out of a courtroom drama, neat, sharp, and too clean for this kind of nonsense. "Mixers rented under the HOA's name," Torres said, holding up a clipboard. "Signature matches the one on their annual budget filings. Says it's for landscaping projects." "Landscaping," Delgado repeated, turning to Randy. "You mind telling me which part of landscaping involves pouring half a yard of cement on a private vehicle?" Randy looked like he wanted to disappear into his own shadow. I just did what I was told." "She said it was approved, that it was part of a compliance order." Delgado raised an eyebrow. "Compliance doesn't include destruction of property. You're aware of that, right?" Before Randy could answer, Margaret reappeared from the corner of her garage, talking loudly on the phone as if this were just another HOA brunch crisis. When she saw the uniformed officers, her tone flipped from irritated to condescending in a blink. "Oh, officers," she said, waving a manicured hand. "I assume you're here to document the removal of that eyesore. We've had numerous complaints about that vehicle. It's been a blight on the neighborhood for days." Delgado didn't flinch. "Ma'am, we're here because a resident reported criminal damage to property. We've reviewed preliminary evidence suggesting this was a deliberate act by you and your contractor." She scoffed. "Oh, please. That truck has been violating community standards for nearly a week. We gave him warnings. This was simply enforcement." "You don't have the authority to damage private property," Torres said, flipping open a small folder. And according to state statute, coordinated destruction of someone else's belongings, especially using rented equipment, qualifies as felony vandalism. Margaret blinked. That's absurd. We're the governing body here. We can make exceptions to certain municipal policies if they interfere with HOA standards. Delgado crossed his arms. That's not how the law works. You're not above state property laws. The footage we've reviewed already shows you instructing the contractor. We'll be collecting the security video and taking statements. Her eyes darted toward the camera mounted on my garage, then back to the mixer truck. For the first time, her expression cracked. I demand to speak with your supervisor, she said sharply. You'll get your chance, Torres replied. At the station. They placed her under arrest right there on my lawn. No drama, no yelling. Just a pair of cuffs, a bored Miranda warning, and a stunned silence from the neighbors who had started gathering on the sidewalk. A few phones were out. One woman across the street was recording from behind her rose bushes, whispering commentary like it was a reality show. Randy didn't get cuffed. Delgado said they'd need more info before charging him, but they took his statement on the spot. He looked like he wanted to melt into the mixer. By late afternoon, the truck was still buried and the cement had hardened enough that chipping it away wasn't going to happen. I'd already filed an insurance claim. The adjuster told me it was likely totaled, and I'd probably need to replace it outright. Luckily, I had full coverage. While I was still on the phone with my insurance rep, a tall man in a collared shirt and khakis walked up the driveway holding a folder. "Mr. Peterson?" he asked. "That's me. Name's Brian Weller. I'm with the state attorney's office. I got a call from the precinct this morning after they booked Willow. Sounds like your HOA's been operating way outside its legal boundaries." I narrowed my eyes. "You came down here in person for that?" He opened the folder. "We've had reports on this HOA before. Nothing this extreme, but similar patterns: overreach, harassment, misuse of funds. This is the first time we've had something this concrete, if you'll pardon the pun. You gave consent for the video footage. Already emailed it. Multiple angles, full audio. Well, that's more than enough to move forward with formal charges. Destruction of private property, conspiracy to commit vandalism, and possible misuse of HOA funds if she used association money for the mixer rental." I crossed my arms. "She did. That's verified." He nodded. "Then we may be looking at embezzlement, too." Over the next 72 hours, things unraveled faster than I expected. A court order froze the HOA's checking account. Weller's office subpoenaed their financial records for the past 5 years. Turns out Margaret had been funneling association dues into vanity projects, garden sculptures, unnecessary security patrols, and a private landscaping crew that only serviced her property and a few loyal board members. Residents were furious, especially once word got out that she'd used nearly $8,000 of HOA funds to rent the mixer, pay Randy under the table, and cover up the incident with a staged email thread about community beautification. I didn't have to do much. The neighborhood turned on her like she was radioactive. A week later, I walked into the community center for the emergency board meeting. The place was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, and the air was thick with the sound of whispered outrage. On the small stage at the front, a temporary committee had been formed to oversee the HOA until a formal election could be held. They'd already removed Margaret from her position. She was facing trial for felony charges, and her bail hearing had been a spectacle. A man named Curtis, a retired postal worker and longtime resident, stepped up to the microphone. "We've all seen the footage," he said. "We've all read the forensic audit. Margaret Willow betrayed this community for years. But the worst part? She thought she could get away with it." He pointed at me. "But thanks to Mr. Peterson's quick thinking and willingness to stand up, we've got a shot at rebuilding our neighborhood the right way." The room burst into applause. I wasn't expecting it. Didn't want it, really. I just wanted to be able to park in my own driveway without being targeted. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me, people I'd barely interacted with before. They thanked me, apologized for not speaking up sooner. One woman even offered to help me shop for a replacement truck. I ended up buying a used Ford F-150. Nothing flashy, just reliable. And this time I installed a second camera angled toward the street. You never know who's watching or who needs to be watched. And if someone ever tries to dump cement on my property again, well, let's just say the whole neighborhood's paying attention now. The morning after the emergency board meeting, I found a handwritten envelope wedged in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words scrawled in tight, frantic handwriting. You think this is over? Watch your back. I stood at the curb, reading it twice, then folding it slowly and sliding it into my back pocket. The handwriting wasn't Margaret's. I'd seen enough of her notes to know she dotted her I's with tiny loops. This was different, angular, rushed, and clearly written in a panic. I walked directly back inside and set the letter under a desk lamp. I'd recently upgraded my home office with a dot matrix scanner and digital archive system, mostly for work receipts, but now it was coming in handy for evidence. After scanning the letter, I called Brian Weller at the state attorney's office. He didn't answer, but I left a message summarizing the threat and told him I'd drop the letter off in person. Half an hour later, I walked into the same government building where Margaret had been processed just days before. Weller met me in the lobby, dressed in a charcoal sport coat and looking slightly more exhausted than when I'd last seen him. "You're not the only one," he said after reading the letter. 3 other residents found similar notes this morning. All handwritten, all unsigned. Looks like someone's trying to intimidate anyone cooperating with the investigation. You think it's one of the board members who wasn't charged? That's our working theory. We're pulling phone records and financial logs from the remaining board members. If there's a connection, we'll find it. I left the letter with him and returned home to find a city work crew in reflective vests standing on my front lawn. One of them waved me over, clipboard in hand. "Evening, sir. You Wyatt Peterson?" "Yeah. City sent us out to evaluate your storm drain. HOA filed a request last month claiming it was leaking into their irrigation system." I blinked. "There's no irrigation system on my property." "That's what we thought. But the request was marked urgent priority. We flagged the submission as suspicious. Just wanted to let you know we're not doing any digging until it's sorted." The worker handed me a copy of the request form. The signature? Dated 3 weeks before the cement incident. Submitted under an alias Martin W. Leclerc. Back inside, I pulled out my HOA meeting notes from earlier that year. No one named Martin W. Leclerc had ever been listed as a resident, board member, or even a temporary contractor. But the handwriting on the form? It matched the threatening letter exactly. I called Weller again, and this time he picked up. "That's enough for a warrant," he said. "We'll move on it today." By 5:30 that evening, police served a search warrant on the home of Leonard Haskins, the HOA's former treasurer. He'd resigned quietly 2 months prior, citing health concerns. Turns out, he'd been helping Margaret cook the books for years and had forged multiple work orders to funnel city services away from properties owned by residents who opposed the board. Inside his garage, investigators found a stack of pre-filled HOA violation forms, several blank citation pads, and a burner phone used exclusively to send anonymous complaints to city code enforcement. The kicker? A half-used notebook filled with copied signatures, including mine. By nightfall, Leonard was in custody, facing charges of forgery, harassment, and obstruction of justice. His arrest blew the entire case wide open. Weller called me the next morning with updates. "We traced over 20 false complaints to Leonard," he said. "Everything from fabricated mold issues to made-up utility violations. He even submitted a request to have your trash pickup suspended for noncompliance." I exhaled slowly. All of this just to punish people who didn't roll over. More like to keep everyone quiet. The HOA had turned into a private punishment machine. And Leonard? He was the one pulling most of the strings behind the curtain. Later that week, the city hosted a community forum at the local high school auditorium. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly with residents who'd once kept their heads down, now openly furious and ready to speak out. City officials, legal reps from the state attorney's office, and even a county judge were present. I didn't plan on speaking, but when they opened the floor, I found myself walking to the mic. "My truck's gone," I said. "That's not what I'm mad about anymore. What really bothers me is how easily they convinced us to stop asking questions. They made us afraid of fines, citations, and retaliation. And when that didn't work, they destroyed property and forged documents. The room was silent. But it only worked because we let them. We trusted a system that was never transparent. That ends now. When I stepped down, the audience erupted into applause, not the kind for a performance, but the kind that comes from people realizing they're no longer alone. In the weeks that followed, the state's investigation led to even more arrests. 2 former board members were indicted for financial fraud after they were caught funneling HOA money into shell landscaping companies they secretly owned. Weller's team found falsified invoices, duplicate payments, and falsified emergency repair charges on homes that had never received service. The city revoked the HOA's charter pending court proceedings, stripping them of their authority until a full election could be held under legal supervision. A court-appointed trustee took over management of the neighborhood in the interim. Without the HOA's chokehold, things changed fast. Contractors who'd been forced to pay permits to work on residents' homes came forward with receipts. One local electrician admitted he'd been blacklisted for refusing to donate to the HOA's beautification fund. He now had a folder full of emails proving it. Residents who had paid fines under duress, some of them elderly and on fixed incomes, filed for restitution. A class action lawsuit was already in the works by a local law firm offering pro bono services. And as for me, I'd replaced the truck, but I also started walking more. Not out of necessity, just because people stopped me now. They asked questions, shared their stories. The neighborhood felt different, lighter. One afternoon, I was standing in my driveway when a kid on a bike slowed down and pointed at the new security camera I'd mounted on the flagpole in my yard. "Hey, is that one of those motion sensor ones?" "Yup," I said. "Got it synced to my phone. Records and stores everything." He nodded. "Cool. My dad said we're putting one up too. Said it's better if we all watch out for each other." Couldn't argue with that. And maybe that was the silver lining in all this. We stopped waiting for someone else to protect us. We stopped thinking silence was safety. And once the fear broke, the whole thing came crashing down like dried concrete. The HOA thought they were untouchable. They built their kingdom on threats, lies, and forged papers. But they forgot one thing: cement cracks, and people remember. Curtis knocked on my door just past 9 in the morning. He stood there holding a thick binder with a rubber band wrapped twice around it. Behind him, the street was quiet for once. No clipboard warriors. No HOA patrols pretending to be authority figures. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. "If that thing has more fraud in it, you're going to need caffeine." "Already had 2 cups, he said, easing into the dining chair and setting the binder down. "This isn't about fraud." "Not exactly." He undid the rubber band and flipped to a section near the middle. Dozens of printed photos slid into view, some aerial shots, others grainy close-ups. One showed a series of pipes dug just below the community garden, snaking toward the back of Margaret's property. "These were taken by a drone last month," he said. "My nephew's in real estate photography. He was testing out his gear while visiting. Took a few shots of the neighborhood for fun." I stared at the image. "That's a water line. It's bypassing the main meter." "Exactly," Curtis said. "And here's the kicker: Margaret's been rerouting water from the community's irrigation system directly into her private lot. That koi pond she built last year? It's being filled with water we all paid for. She said the city approved that garden expansion." Curtis shook his head. "City planner confirmed there was never a permit. And she didn't just dig into the irrigation lines. She redirected part of the stormwater drain under her property to avoid runoff penalties. That's why your drain was flagged. Leonard submitted that fake work order to cover their tracks. They were testing whether the city would notice if they tampered with the system." I leaned against the counter. "So not only were they vandalizing property, but also tampering with city utilities, which is a felony." Multiple counts, if the DA's office agrees. I flipped through the binder. Receipts, blueprints, emails from a contractor who pulled out of the project halfway through. The guy had been paid in cash with no tax documentation. He kept copies of everything just in case. Curtis sat back. If we turn this in, it's going well beyond just HOA misconduct. We don't turn it in, I said. We deliver it directly to the city inspector and Weller's office. They'll know how to escalate it properly. That afternoon, the city inspector met us in the neighborhood commons. He brought a survey crew and a digital scanner to trace the underground lines. In less than an hour, they confirmed the illegal connection Margaret had tapped into the main irrigation line upstream from the community meter, diverting thousands of gallons monthly to her property. By evening, the city issued an emergency injunction. Public Works shut off the entire irrigation system to prevent further theft. Weller's team filed an emergency motion with the county court to execute a property search. When the warrant came through the next morning, a convoy of marked vehicles rolled into the neighborhood. Forensics vans, utility trucks, 2 unmarked sedans with state prosecutors inside. Margaret wasn't home, but her husband, Arthur, was. He answered the door in slippers and a robe, blinking like a man who just realized the foundation of his house had been built on clay. I don't know anything about permits, he told the officers. My wife handles all that. An hour later, they found a hidden pump system beneath the garden shed, connected to a buried PVC manifold. It had been disguised beneath faux gravel panels and a hinged floorboard. The pump had been operating on a timer, filling her koi pond and underground cistern every 2 days. Weller arrived just as the evidence was being cataloged. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded, walked over to Curtis and me, and said, "This changes the scope of the case. We're dealing with theft of public utilities, environmental tampering, and conspiracy to defraud municipal systems. I'll be filing for additional charges immediately." By nightfall, Margaret had been tracked down at a hotel 2 towns over. She was taken into custody without incident. The court didn't grant bail this time. 3 days later, the county held a public hearing. I sat in the 3rd row beside Curtis, watching as Weller laid out the charges: destruction of private property, misuse of HOA funds, forgery, illegal utility diversion, and environmental violation. The judge listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. Margaret's attorney tried to argue that the utility modification was a misunderstanding and that the HOA had verbal permission from a city contractor. But Weller dropped a transcript of the contractor's deposition in front of the bench, a sworn statement that Margaret offered him an under-the-table cash bonus to forget about the paperwork. The judge didn't even flinch. In light of the evidence, she said, "This court finds probable cause to proceed with full prosecution on all counts. Defendant is remanded into custody and the case will be expedited under environmental and property damage statutes." Outside the courtroom, reporters clustered around Weller. I didn't stop to give interviews. I just walked out with Curtis, down the courthouse steps and into the afternoon sun. She thought it would never catch up to her, Curtis said. That she could hide behind paperwork, use HOA language to cover her tracks, and no one would challenge it. She underestimated how much people notice when their water bill doubles, I replied. Within 24 hours of the hearing, the state dissolved the HOA's legal charter. The Department of Consumer Affairs appointed a state monitor to oversee all remaining operations until a new community governance model could be established. No more board, no more fines, no more anonymous citations. Instead, we formed a neighborhood council, open membership, rotating roles, every decision subject to public vote. We even set up a shared website with transparent budgeting tools and open records. Some residents were hesitant at first. Years of rule by fear doesn't vanish overnight. But once the first town hall wrapped without anyone being threatened over mailbox paint colors, people started warming up. 3 weeks later, I hosted a block party in my front yard. Grill going. Tables set up with lemonade and baked goods. The new Ford parked off to the side, clean and untouched. For the first time, I didn't feel like I needed cameras to monitor the street. Not because crime had vanished, but because trust had started to grow in its place. Midway through the party, an older woman I'd never met approached me with a covered dish and a tentative smile. "I used to be afraid to come to these," she said, handing me the casserole. "I was cited once for planting tulips that weren't on the approved color list. Margaret made me dig them up." "Well," I said, lifting the foil, "these look like they're on the approved menu." She laughed. Not a forced laugh, but a real one. That night, as the last guests drifted home, I sat on the porch with Curtis. The sky was clear. The air smelled like grilled corn and citronella candles. We didn't talk much, just watched the street and listened to the quiet. Eventually, he said, "Think they'll try to start another HOA someday?" "They can try," I said. "But this time, we'll pay attention from the start." He nodded. "That's the difference now, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said. "Now we know what to look for. And we won't let it happen again." Justice didn't come quickly. It didn't come cleanly. But it came. And in its place, something better took root. Not control. Not rules. Community.